Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sai here today to discuss with you a topic that's actually been requested by you yourselves, viewers. Now, this actually comes as a request to actually look at the air war that happened during the First World War. Now, we've done a lot on the ground warfare. We've looked at tanks, we've looked at machine guns, and throughout our series that we've done now, we've looked at various ground tactics that have occurred. Well, quite right, as a few of you pointed out in a few of the comment sections, we have not actually done much on the air war. We made a brief reference to it on occasions throughout the series, but this video is going to be holistically dedicated to giving you some good detail and a good background and an overview about the air war, and again, mostly focusing on the British perspective. We will, of course, consider German planes and German actions as well, and particularly the concept of the aces. So in this video, we're going to look at the types of planes, their roles during the war, and the aces, who are they, and any notable battles they actually took part in, and of course then link it back to our experience on the Western Front that we have gathered now throughout this very long series on the Western Front. So with all that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So first off, we're going to look at the roles of planes. Now there were several roles they had during the First World War, but actually the most common one for them was the idea of reconnaissance. Some roughly 90% of sorties flown during the war from 1914 to 1918 was solely fixated on reconnaissance. Now, we should be very clear when we say reconnaissance, what are we actually talking about? Well, this was the idea where you'd scope out the enemy territory, you'd try and figure out their movements, figure out how their trenches were set up, and you'd use that information you gathered on reconnaissance, take it back to your headquarters, tell your men, tell your soldiers, and then you'd go on and use that information to help you have a better chance of fighting them an offensive later in the war, or maybe to better prepare your defenses for an attack they were setting up on a flank, for instance. So how they would do this, the planes would fly high in the sky, as you can see on the image, and they would see the aerial landscape, and they would see the landscape below them, and be able to take pictures on these big bulky cameras they have, and use the pictures to get a clear understanding. Right, here we are on this road here, there's a trench there, on that bit of woodland there's a clear machine gun nest set up. Oh, hiding in the back on that salient, there's a clear artillery battery all set up. All these kind of things, and they would use that to get a good lay of the land, what they could see, and the same for enemy movement as well. See if they moved anywhere during the conflict, see if they were making any sort of offensive action or maybe defensive preparation. In fact, to link to our studies already in 1917, reconnaissance was a big reason Allied forces realized the Germans were retreating to that Hindenburg line after the failures of the Somme and Verdun offensives in 1916. So as said, they initially would use cameras to do this. They'd take some clear pictures, but they were quite bulky and quite finicky to use in the plane, especially thousands of feet in the air. So they eventually evolved to have them be shorter, have them be smaller, and they even began to actually relay information live via radio instead. So they could actually give the command headquarters some key knowledge from the air, and they could go very quickly to taking it and making plans on the ground. Typically, the most concrete form of information would come about was by the maps that would be created. They would make these maps, they would be quite accurate, and of course, then they would be able to update the positions with live radio feed that was coming throughout the day. Now, of course, these developments weren't instantaneous. Initially, the recon strategies were quite primitive in their success. In fact, it's worth noting at this stage that as technology improves with the aircraft, their reconnaissance missions also improved. And the two main reasons for this are one, they could fly faster, and two, they could fly higher. For instance, the British FE-2A at the start of the war could only fly around 55 miles per hour, whereas by the end of the war, the Sopwith Camel, for example, by contrast, could fly at 220 miles per hour on average. So there's some clear evolution with technology, and much like how we saw with the other themes, this is clearly one that's going to recur as the war goes on. But it wasn't just the British who were making use of crafts. The Germans also had their own version as well. For instance, at the start of the war, they developed the Zeppelin. Now, these Zeppelins were used predominantly to attack the British home front. They would fly over at night, and they'd be big, bulky, balloon-like objects in the sky. And they would be used to bomb British civilian cities and be used to try and disrupt and cause psychological harm to the civilians living at home. They were quite intermittent, though. They weren't a consistent raid. In fact, mostly they were used in 1915 and 16 with 19 and 22 missions respectively. But all in all, throughout the whole war, roughly 6,000 bombs were dropped and 600 civilians were killed, 1,400 others were injured. Now, compared to the mass slaughter that was happening at the likes of the Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele, and so forth, these are quite minuscule numbers, which is why the key success of the Zeppelin waves was the psychological impact to try and convince the British people they weren't safe, even though they had the English Channel separating them from the conflicts in France and Belgium. But it's very difficult for the Germans to prove that when the British developed anti-aircraft fire. These were ground-level guns, and they would fire high into the sky, and they would destroy these Zeppelins. And the Germans eventually, as the war went on by 1917-1918, realized the Zeppelins were costing too much to make in materials, as the German High Command began to shift their focus away from making Zeppelins and focus more on their own planes, their own fighter aircraft instead. Now, they were the two main types of aircraft, especially at the start of the war. But by 1916, the aircraft became increasingly used in combat operations instead. So, for instance, the British, their Royal Flying Corps, the RFC as they were called, they initially were just, as I say, focusing on the reconnaissance, and their idea was to assist the land army, the infantry that was fighting on the ground. But this changed when they began to realize they actually could attach a machine gun onto their planes. So they developed the idea of a biplane, and there'd be a machine gun attached to the plane, and through that machine gun, they could shoot down enemy aircraft instead. It became quite common for these fighter planes to assist the recon planes by engaging in dogfights with other enemy units. So typically, the initial first instances were using these fighter planes to shoot down enemy recon planes. But once both sides began to use fighter aircraft, they engaged in dogfights with each other. So it's very common for these planes to have duels in the sky and get involved in some high heated aerial battles. That's the roles for them: reconnaissance, attacking civilian positions, and engaging in combat or dogfights with other fighters. So, what type of planes did we actually have? Well, as I said, most planes were biplanes. As the word bi says, there were two members on the plane. You would have a pilot at the front of the plane guiding where it would go, and you'd have a machine gunner in the rear whose job was to shoot down the recon planes, maybe disrupt some trenches if they were flying low enough, or to fight off other fighter planes instead. Now, initially, these were quite dangerous to use because you're at risk of where it was positioned of shooting the warning propeller that was at the front of your plane near the fuselage. So, because of this, you would actually shoot yourself down and cause mass damage. However, a turning point came in 1916 when the Germans, with their new Albatros D2, that would eventually evolve into the elite pursuit squadrons known as the Jagdstaffel. What these were new types of planes that were fitted with a Fokker mechanism. Now, this was made by Dutch inventor Anthony Fokker, and his idea was the mechanism would prevent it from shooting its own plane. It would stop the plane from shooting itself, and it would only allow the gun to turn to the degree needed to shoot at the enemy planes. These became very effective with the Jagdstaffels, as I said, because they were faster, they could fly higher, and because they weren't at risk of shooting their own plane now, they could effectively shoot the enemy plane. Thanks to the new mechanism, things like the Britain's FG2s were easily defeated by the Albatros 2 and its successor, the Albatros D3, as the war went on. For instance, in April 1917 alone, the German Albatros D2 successfully shot down 275 Allied aircraft. This caused the British to also evolve, and they developed the Sopwith Camel in 1917. When this debuted in May time, it proved quite effective. It could fly even higher than the Albatros, and it could fly even faster as well. And it showed some decisive success. It shot down over 1,000 aircraft in its first 3 months of use alone, and it also gave rise to a very strong batch of British aces as well. As the Allied war machine progressed, by 1918, the RAF, as it was now called, the Royal Air Force, could produce 11,000 of these in a single month, while the Germans could only produce about 2,000. The Germans tried to advance further, and they made the faster, smoother Fokker D7. However, the production was quite minimal. The Germans did lack materials by 1918, so in effect, you could fairly say the British did rule the skies by mid 1918. What was so successful about the Sopwith Camel, particularly its F1 variant, not just because it had the better engine, it could climb higher, and it had a faster speed, but it also had two synchronized machine guns attached to it. So, of course, it gave it a vast edge in the dogfights that were occurring with the Aces, as we'll say very soon. In fact, by 1918, as I say, they actually were shooting down 1,300 aircraft in the final months of the war very, very easily. But how did this happen? What exactly was the combat that was being conducted? Well, this is where we get onto the flying aces that developed as potential household names during the First World War. Now, a bit of background on how combat was conducted. As we said, you would have a pilot and you would typically have a machine gun in the rear of the plane. And so the ideas that were developed were in combat was first to use clouds for concealment. They would get really close to the enemy. And the reason they did this because they wanted to make sure when they fired, they would definitely hit the enemy plane and cause extreme damage. And then they would also, on occasions, also blind them with sunlight, come into the attack with the sunlight behind them. So if the enemy tried to see them, they'd be blinded, struggle, move out, and of course, be shot down more easily. You typically wanted to get within 100 yards. This was about the accuracy which the machine guns, like the Lewis guns and later the Vickers guns that were used on the Vickers Tempest plane, could fire accurately and quite sensibly into the enemy. The best fighters who were good at doing this were the ones who were called aces. These were pilots who killed at least 5 enemy aircraft. Now, I say killed, but it's very hard to verify how many of the pilots actually were killed when they were shot down. It was very plausible for a pilot to crash land and then to actually escape their plane and manage to flee to safety. However, it was more common for them to crash behind enemy lines, be found by Allied soldiers, and typically taken in for questioning and interrogation instead. There are two very famous aces that came about during the war. One of them is Germany's own Baron Manfred von Richthofen, and the other was Britain's Edward McManus. These were two very, very successful aces over the war. Richthofen himself very famously became the Red Baron because he led the so-called flying circus. These were Jagdstaffel Squadron that were quite famous for painting the underside of their planes various different colours to not only be noted but also be easily recognised by the German artillery and aircraft guns as German planes and therefore not to be shot down. He was very, very successful in the skies. Most accounts have him as having scored a total of 80 kills, or maybe a bit more, since he debuted at the Somme in August 1916. So in 2 years of service, he took down over 80 pilots at least. And he actually took down at least 43 of them by April 1917. So less than a year in the war, he already was taking down quite a lot of British enemy aircraft. As I said, Edward Manick was also very, very successful. There's actually more range on how many he may have killed. Most have him around 60, some have around 70 to 75. I go with the account that I've used this video is 73, but feel free, whatever source yours said, and whatever you have to use for your curriculum at school or college, do make sure you follow it. These were just two of many aces that fought during the war, and quite a big culture came about with the aces for their success. They were seen in propaganda as quite gallant, quite chivalrous, and it was seen as quite a very prestigious thing to be an ace during the conflict and to be praised like they were. However, the tragedy remains with the flying aces. The casualty rate was really high for the conflict, at least 50% in most cases. In fact, 14,000 pilots would die during the war, including Richthofen and Manock. However, I think it's worth noting that of these two most notable aces, the way they died was not in a dogfight with an enemy aircraft or even against each other. It actually came from the ground, from that anti aircraft fire. That's what took them out. As skillful as they were in the sky, how they could maneuver, how they could dodge, how they could climb and dive, their skill was still vulnerable to the efforts of those on the ground to shoot at them. So I think it's worth remembering that as well. So let's wrap it up now and link it back to our studies that we focused on. Now, again, the one I've done throughout this series is the one focusing on the British experience of war. And yes, it does focus on the ground level, but the air war is something all the same we can make note of. So I'm just going to lay out a few questions that you could consider. And as always, comment below your answers to them, how you find them, and what your decision might be for them. I'm also going to leave, as always, some extra resources in the description box as well that you can check out and, of course, research yourself in greater detail. Because, again, for your curriculum, maybe the air war is a bigger study and needs to learn more for it. So do check out those wider readings to help you. But some key questions to consider to now close it up are how vital do you think aircraft actually were? Do you reckon they were more vital as reconnaissance? Were they more useful in their combat role? How about that psychological aspect of attacking the British home front? In fact, in some ways, this is worth noting. What the Zeppelins did for the Germans on the British home front became a source of inspiration for a similar campaign that happened during the Second World War when the German Luftwaffe attacked the British home front, something known as the Blitz during 1940 and 1941, and again with the Little Blitz in 1944 into 1945. So it's worth noting that, although it wasn't the main focus in this war, it did become the precursor for something that became quite a big part of a conflict later down in history. Other things to consider as well are, do you reckon the air technology developed more quickly? And do you think it was more important than the developments on ground technology? I talked a lot in my previous videos similar to this about the tanks, about machine guns, about trench setup. But what do you reckon? Do you reckon aerial technology was quite important at this point in the war? Is it quite vital? Is it, and again, is it more important than those ground technological developments? Again, it's also worth noting about my combined arms comment I made in my Amiens series that the air war, the air technology was a key part of that as well. Again, through that reconnaissance, they could learn the weaknesses in the German positions. They could use their own bombing raids. They could drop supplies in front of the British position for them to go and collect and refill on. So again, they had their role to play. And much like the tanks, like the infantry, and like the artillery, perhaps without air war as well, combined arms would not have been as successful as it proved to be. And the final question you could potentially consider is, to what extent can we say that Britain definitely ruled the skies during the conflict on the Western Front? So, of course, when we say ruled the skies, is that just purely having more success? Is that actually periods of dominance where they were in big control, having lots of success? Is it numerical advantage? For instance, at the Somme, they had a 2-1 advantage there. But at Verdun, the French lacked that because there were so many German fighter planes that were used on that front, because that was where their offensive was at. Remember, for the Germans, the Somme was a defensive action, soaking up the pressure of the Anglo-French assault. So there's difference how we can interpret that as well. But all the same, but as I say, do make sure you let me know in the comments below. I hope you found this video quite useful, quite insightful. I'm going to finish off this series in my following couple of videos where we're going to focus on the lions led by donkeys myth. But again, this is what it's all about. Do feel free to ask and request more content. More can be given, especially if it will prove relevant for you in your studies, whether GCSE or A level, or maybe just as a passion piece. Maybe you have a passion for this sort of content and want to see more of it on YouTube. So, of course, let me know and I can quite happily assist if possible. So, all that said, thank you for watching. This is History with Sire, and thank you for listening.